Hey, what is up? Welcome to this episode of the Entrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lofermento, and I feel like there's three words that have followed me for 16 years as an entrepreneur. I've always heard these, and it still rings true today, and that is content is king. We've all heard it in so many different ways, and that's why today I'm so excited to be joined by a guest who not only understands the importance and the value of content marketing, but this is someone who really flourishes when it comes to bringing it into reality, especially if you are one of those people. I'm going to lump myself in here that you've found yourself wondering, what's my secret sauce? What's going to make my content any different from everybody else's? Well, today's guest is going to challenge us and really invite us in a positive way to step into our special sauce. So let me tell you all about today's guest. His name is James Merkley. James is the owner and founder of StoryPath Creative, which is a content creation and content coaching agency that has helped their clients see well over 10 million views on social media. James is a husband to his wife, Erin. He's a father to his son, Ander, and he loves getting to do life and business in the beauty of Colorado. There must be something in the air in Colorado because I feel like we have so many amazing guests from the mountains. He was a professional musician for nearly 10 years before he jumped into business ownership and entrepreneurship. Since he made that shift, he has never looked back. He has over a decade of experience in professional branding and video production, and James is passionate about helping his clients find that thing I teased about already, their secret sauce, and use that to help them discover and build their online audiences that they can then monetize. He has helped businesses grow new revenue streams from social media and has worked with nonprofits all across the country, helping them raise millions of dollars in funding. He loves it when he gets to help his coaching clients grow from zero to hero. So if your limiting belief coming into today's episode is, well, I don't even have an audience, I don't even have people who know who I am, well, that's okay, because James loves doing this on social media without spending thousands of dollars on an agency doing it for them. So I'm personally equally as excited as you all are to learn from James here today. So I'm not going to say anything else. Let's dive straight into my interview with James Merkley. All right, James, I am so very excited that you're here with us today. First things first, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm excited to be here.
Heck yes, there's so many cool aspects of your story and your journey, and I can already see, I would imagine that being a musician and being in the production side of the world gives you so many insights into it. But before we talk content marketing, before we talk about the content itself, take us beyond the bio. Who's James? How'd you start doing all this cool stuff?
Oh man, that's a long story. I think I've always been, I got late diagnosed with ADHD as an adult, and it makes a ton of sense because my life has always been just like ping ponging between things and opportunities. I've never been able to sit still and just do a job in one place. I've always been dabbling in so many different areas, doing a bunch of different things. And so even when I worked full time in other companies and with other opportunities, I was always dabbling and putting my hands and my fingers into creative things. And I'm really big on what's the future hold for creatives, and what's the future hold for just society and just people who are trying to make money online or make money for their businesses. And so I've just always been trying to figure out, how do we move forward into the future as creatives, especially because I've been a creative my whole life, and it's like, how do I help other creatives do the same thing, and how do I help people in general move forward into the future and not be afraid of it, but leverage it in ways that are actually beneficial for their lives. And so that's a little bit about me. I in terms of just like outside of my work life, I love just getting to spend time with my family. I'm at my core, I'm a homebody. I'm an introvert to the T, and I love just spending time at home with my son. He's 2.5. My wife, we've literally tomorrow is our 10-year anniversary, and I just love getting to spend time with my family, my close friends, and then enjoying the beautiful Colorado landscape. There's so much fun to do here, skiing, being in the incredible wilderness of the mountains, and just spending time doing outside activities. There's just so much to do here. And so I live a very genuinely blessed life, even when it's hard. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to just to be here and talk about how to find people's secret sauce today.
Yes, I love that overview, James, because it's good to know that I'm in similar company in the fact that it sounds like you're also easily excitable about literally all of the things. And so with that in mind, I would just want to tack on to all those great things that you just shared with us in your overview, because when I look at your business and your work and really your area of expertise and everything you do with StoryPath, I don't even know where to begin, James, because what I see, I'll list out a few things, is I see the story component of it. Of course, it's in the name of your business. It's obviously a very core part of it. But then I also think about the actual content. A lot of people worry about production, and then even going a step further, what about the platforms? Obviously, success on social media is so important to you. And then I'm just going to throw one more thing into the mixer before I kick it back to you, is the strategic component. You understand that all of this content is for a purpose, whether it's nonprofits looking to fundraise, businesses looking to convert new customers and clients. These are 4 big areas that I've just thrown onto the table, James. How do we start making sense of it? When you look at the scope of what you do, what are those ingredients that you look at?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I break this down is storytelling has, throughout all of human history, it has always been the vessel at which things are pioneered. As civilization is advanced, people grow and develop their skills. Storytelling has always been the framework for how society moves forward. If you think about it, if we could look way back in history, storytelling was the way that mentors would create new mentorship and help their people move forward in their fields. They would teach and they would tell stories. And if you look at kind of modern day application of storytelling, brands are doing storytelling all the time. You're saturated with storytelling, from the creative storytelling that you see on your favorite TV program or movies or video games or wherever, all the way down to a simple ad. You're always being, I guess, indoctrinated with somebody's story that they're putting in front of you. Now, the thing is, there's good storytelling and there's bad storytelling. And we've all been at that party when you try and tell a story to somebody and everybody's just kind of sipping their drinks and they're like, okay, yeah, the great, cool story, bro. That was awesome, right? And nobody seems to connect with your story. And this has happened, I'm sure, to everybody. Contrast that with those people who, for some reason, whenever they tell a story, the whole room just zeroes in on what they're trying to say. It's like this magnetism. It's like they just know how to use the right tone and frequency, and the communication styles that they use are just, they hit home at the right moments, and people zero into that story. And typically people have some sort of a transformation. Either they laugh loud because the story's funny, or they start crying because the story is really intense and emotionally driven. But either which way, the story produces a outcome. And so the reason why I call my company StoryPath is because every company wants an outcome. If you're a business owner, if you're a business developer, if you work in business, you always are looking for some kind of an outcome to some degree or another. And where a lot of businesses seem to fail is that they forget that story is the vessel, the path, aka story path. Story is the pathway to getting to that outcome, but you have to learn and tell great stories along the way. So what I do with my team is we kind of help companies and businesses wherever they're at in their journey of being a storytelling brand, being a storytelling company. We want to help them on the DIY side, where they don't have a ton of budget to tell their story, but they're like, hey, I can hustle, I can learn, I can grow. And we come in, same sort of methodology as used in historical days when you had a mentorship or a mentor and a mentee and an apprentice, if you will, and that mentor turns that apprentice into the master, right? We want to do the same thing. We help our clients turn themselves into the master because we're hand-holding them to that process. And then we have companies and businesses that they're like, hey, we have budget. We want you to do our storytelling. And that's where we use our strategies and we use our equipment. We use our vehicle, and we actually produce the content that tells a great story. And then lastly, if there's companies that are like, James, I love all this. This is fantastic. I don't want to touch storytelling. I want you to touch storytelling. You're the master. You're the expert. You go for it. We do that for them. We have turnkey solutions as well. So basically, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to teach and equip companies and businesses on how to ingest their personal story, not someone else's, not some popular story that's out there, but their personal story into everything they do. Because at the end of the day, I think we live in this day and age where people are connecting to stories more than ever before. I don't know if you've seen this, Brian, in maybe your podcast series, but and maybe in your analytics, but it would be interesting for me to learn about this. But I'm sure the people who have dynamic storytelling abilities, they have those like 0 to hero stories and they tell those stories. I'm sure those are probably maybe some of your better performing podcasts. And it's fascinating to me, but a lot of people come to me, and this is the most tragic thing that I hear a lot. People come to me and say, James, this is really good information. This is awesome. I love this, but I don't have a story to tell. And that breaks my heart, like genuinely breaks my heart every single time. And the reason why is because we all have a story. We all have something that's going to connect us with different people. We all have something, a secret sauce. And I have a plaque over on my wall that says, if you search for gold in others, you will find it. And sometimes people just need to learn that they can search for gold in themselves. They can search for gold in their own company and they can find it. And so my job as a storytelling agent, aka a teacher on how to tell stories, or if I'm doing it for the company, my goal is I hunt for that gold. I hunt for that secret sauce. I hunt for that special thing, that special story that encapsulates that person or that company or that brand, and then I figure out, how do I communicate this? How do we build an audience around this? And everybody has something. You just have to find it. I have yet to find somebody that just has a dud of a story that doesn't go anywhere. I don't think that kind of a story exists. It's just the way that you tell it that usually is what makes it flop. So that's a big overview of what we do. There's a lot of minutia to it, but that's kind of like the 30,000 foot view.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, James. I'll tell you what, listeners, we're definitely going to get to how do you find that secret sauce? How do you find that gold that James is talking about? But before we get there, James, I will say one thing that stands out in everything that you just shared with us, including the party analogy, which we can all relate to. I feel like anytime I tell a bad story, it just ends with, I guess you had to be there. And what really stands out, though, the way you talk about it, is it actually sounds to me like you're less interested in the content of the story and you're more interested in the delivery of the story, the words, the framing, the emotions that we inject into it. Talk to us about that, because actually one other thing that you said towards the end there is storytelling abilities. And I think this is such an important part for all of our listeners to take away from today's episode, is the fact that it's not about having the greatest story. You're right. I mean, I know as a podcaster, we all love those clickbaity titles where like someone who arrived in the country with $10 in their pockets, became a multimillionaire. Everyone loves that clickbaity title and that hook, of course, from the content of the story. But talk to us, content aside, about that delivery. What do storytelling abilities, what do they look like?
Yeah, and that's such a great question, because abilities they need to take shape and form depending on the audience. You can't tell the same story to the same audience or to a different audience the way you told it to the previous audience, if that makes sense. A practical example of this is that you can't take how you tell a story from a stage. If you're a public speaker, you can't take that story and tell it the exact same way on social media, right? There's a lot of constrictions. There's a lot of parameters. You obviously have less time to hook an audience on social media than you do in a live audience setting from a stage. So telling stories, there's an art to it. There's a dynamic nature to telling stories that you have to learn, and you have to figure out where your audience is best positioned. So this is where me and my team, we get really strategic. When we're going to tell someone's story, or when I'm coaching somebody on how to tell their own story, we start with where might your audience be? Who are they? What are they doing? Like, what's your customer avatar? Companies need to know these things, because if you don't know who you're trying to target, you can't tell a story that's going to hook them. You can't tell a story that's going to captivate them. I told this story when I was presenting a while back. And I knew I was talking to kind of blue collar workers. And I knew that I was presenting in front of a bunch of blue collar workers. And I was talking about content creation and how you grow your business, but I wanted to tell a story. And so I embedded this story of a dusty old pair of boots, and I made some flair around it, and I made it all about the blue collar experience. And that story was a totally made up story, but I was trying to prove a point that a story that has no actual application in reality can be powerful. And so you have to figure out what stories are going to captivate your audience, and how do you bridge the gap, aka how do you create that pathway between where you're at and your audience, and how do you connect your story to that audience? So one of the things that I love to start with my clients when I'm trying to help them figure this out is I like to ask them, like, who's your favorite person to talk to? We all have that person in our lives that we can just sit with them and talk for hours and hours and hours. And if you're a smaller business, that's your target customer, typically. This person that you just can zero in on, and you can talk with them for hours, and they clearly connect with you. And it's like, how do you connect with those people, and how do you tell a story for what they need? So for example, if I were creating a customer avatar, my typical customer is somebody who scrolls a lot on social media. Okay, so I know I need to tell a story that hooks them in the first 3 to 4 seconds, right? I know that that's a tough thing for a lot of businesses, but you can tell a story or hook them in the first 3 to 4 seconds. Some people's audiences are found in podcast forms like yours. And it's like, okay, how do I hook them in the first maybe 5 to 10 seconds? I love how you did your intro, Brian, because you spend a lot of time crafting these intros for your guests. And in that crafting process, it's clear that's where you're hooking your audience. You're giving your audience what they need in that first maybe 10 to 15 seconds, maybe even 20, 30 seconds. And that's what's connecting them to the show. And so these are like the things that you have to remember. Like every story you tell, it's going to be based off of who you're talking to, what's the platform that you're using, and what are kind of the limitations to that story. Because there can be good storytelling done anywhere. You can do it in any setting, even a crowded party with lights and sounds and big music. You can still tell a story where people zero in and lean into what you're saying. And you can tell a bad story too, like we were talking about, where people are like, okay, well, good story, dude. So it all depends. It all depends.
Yeah, so well said. Such important considerations for us. And James, you're right. This actually feels like the first time in 1,100 episodes that someone's calling out and breaking that fourth wall of, yeah, as a podcaster, I recognize the first 10 seconds of the episode. Of course, my intro, I want to read your bio and I want to introduce you to the audience. But I always am very acutely aware of the fact that I need to talk about something that applies to their businesses. And so, when we talk about content is king, it's something that we've all heard, and people say, oh yeah, I actually do want to go deeper into that topic. So I really love the fact that you called that out, James, as an example. But part of being a podcast host is also having my listener hat on and saying, what are the limiting beliefs? What are the excuses that people are going to have as they're hearing you say this? And inevitably, I knew that we'd go here in today's conversation, and that is, you've already addressed it, which is, James, I don't have a story. I don't know what my story is to tell. I used to feel this way, James, personally, as I was like, I'm a 22-year-old back when I started my marketing agency. I'm a 22-year-old white dude from a suburb in central Massachusetts. Like, what's my story? Who got a 4-year degree and started an agency, and I hope that I'm successful with this. I didn't know what my story was, James. Talk to us. Directly address all those people, which we've all been there, who feel like they don't have that story or they don't know where to find that story.
Yeah, and like I said, this is the thing that it breaks my heart, but also it's my favorite place to sit with a person in, because there's such a rawness when somebody comes to me and says, James, I don't know my story. I don't know, like when someone says, I know my story, but I don't know how to tell it. That's a clear ramp into like, okay, let's create strategy. But when someone says, I don't know my story, I don't feel like I have a story. I don't think they compare, they contrast, like you said, they have a limiting belief. It's the most tragic place, but also my favorite place to sit in. And what I usually respond to those people by saying this. I say, you don't have a story because you haven't told it. That's the only reason why you don't have a story. Think about it this way. If The Hobbit was never written, it was still a story. It was still in J.R.R. Tolkien's head, right? It was still there. It was conceptualized. It just hadn't been told. Stories are told, right? And so at the end of the day, you have a story. It's just about telling it. And one of my favorite things to do with people when they are in the process of like discovering themselves a little bit, because there is a process in this whole development of your story. There's a part of the process where you have to discover yourself, especially if you're a small business. If you're a medium to large business, it's a little harder to do this. It takes a little bit more of a systemic sort of approach. But if you're a small business, you get the luxury of doing this by yourself, which is tremendously important. And what I love to tell small business owners to do, and for your audience that are small business owners, go to the mirror every day for a week. You don't even have to do a full 7 days. You can do 5 days, just the work week, because it's going to be weird. It's going to be obnoxious. You're going to hate it for a little bit. But go to the mirror and tell yourself your story. From the moment you were born to the day that you're living right then and there. Tell yourself your story. Because what happens is, and when I do this exercise for myself, I still do this exercise. And the reason why I do this exercise is because your story is always changing. It's always adapting, right? And there's new elements that get embedded into your story. Also, you can't remember everything. So we have sensory recognition, and sensory things will spark memories to be produced. I just the other day smelled something I think it was a restaurant, and I remembered something from my childhood. It's crazy how hearing things, smelling things, tasting things can spark memories. So retelling your story consistently to yourself reminds you of things that are really powerful nuggets or elements or story beats that you can ingest into your storytelling that make an imprint. But go to the mirror and tell yourself your story first. Because you can't tell anybody else your story until you have at least put it on paper, right? J.R.R. Tolkien, we're using this Hobbit analogy, J.R.R. Tolkien, he put the Hobbit on paper before he ever put it to print. There's something so powerful in that whole process, though. He had to flesh out this whole universe, this little Hobbit character named Bilbo Baggins. He had to create an entire world around him before he ever went to print with the book, right? And we need to do the same thing with our stories. We need to figure out, what is our story? If I'm the character of my story, who am I? Where am I going? What's my trajectory? Where have I been? All these different things. And then we can start putting it to print, aka telling other people about our stories. So a lot of the grassroots parts of telling your story is simply by sitting in front of a mirror and just getting it out there, being like, this is my story. And then you fall more in love with your story, or I should say you accept it more. The more you tell it to yourself, the more you learn how to accept your story, and then you can tell it to other people unashamedly. I especially in business ownership, is when you first start in business. I think you were kind of hinting at this, Brian. When you first start, you have imposter syndrome, and you expect that to go away. Even 5 years into running this agency, I still have imposter syndrome. Like some days I wake up and I'm like, what am I doing? Right? Those are the days where I tell myself my story. Those are the days where I funnel in some powerful new element to that story. We just had a nonprofit raise over $1 million for this fundraising that they're doing, this research that could transform a neurological disorder in kids. $1 million, and that's only the first hurdle. But our video reproduced for them plus fundraising raised over $1 million. It's crazy. I get to take that powerful story and embed that into my story now. And so those days when I wake up and I'm feeling like an imposter, I'm like, I'm not an imposter, because I went from here to here to here, and I had victories along the way, right? Bilbo came back to the Shire as a hero, not because he was just heroic, but because he had done stuff along the way that proved he was a hero. So it's so important to tell yourself your own story, because as you do that, you learn how to get better at telling other people your story as well.
Yeah, so many good things in there, James. I want to reiterate for our listeners because two big themes, just honestly, James, the value in those lessons you just gave us, they really sit with me constantly. And it's been a driving force in my 16 years of being an entrepreneur. The first is the power of reps. I love how you didn't say, go in the bathroom and look yourself in the mirror and tell yourself the story today. You said, hey, minimum of 5 business days this week. You want to tell yourself the story. And then the second thing, I think it's so important that you called that out. This is the real stuff of entrepreneurship, which is, I sum this concept up quite simply as the weights don't change, we do. If you and I start picking up 20-pound weights today, they might feel a little bit heavy, but if we keep doing it for a few months, well, the weights are going to feel really light. And it's of course not because the weights change, it's because we change. And I always think about it in the context of a podcast. James, when I tell people that I host a podcast, I always get the same reaction. People are like, oh, I hate the sound of my own voice on a microphone. And I'm like, we all do, but it's normalized to me. Now I just know what I sound like behind a microphone. And I'm sure you're the same way, having been a musician. And so those things, it's not that you and I are different from anyone else. We've just done it enough times that now it's normalized. And so I love those actionable insights and takeaways. I think this stuff transcends just the world of content and storytelling. This is really sound business advice and insights. So James, I want to keep going deeper into the fact that you humble bragged about that nonprofit. And huge kudos to you because that's the impact of the work that we do. But I know that a lot of people are probably wondering what that bridge looks like of, okay, so you tell a story and then you're talking about raising $1 million. And so for the rest of us in our small businesses, maybe we're looking to get 10 new customers or clients. Maybe we have some sort of tangible goal. How do we transform these stories into conversion tools? Are there calls to actions? Is there a bridge that we can build to the desired outcome that we have? Talk to us about turning it into the conversions and results we're looking for.
That's such a great, and that's always the catch-22 to storytelling. It's like, James, you can tell a great story, but if it doesn't produce results, then what happened? And we get this all the time where for every successful story that we produce for a company, let's just say we create a brand film for them or a series of social media posts. At a certain point, you're going to have a not so successful one, right? You do this for enough amount of time, anybody in my industry is going to say, yeah, we had some duds along the way. We praise our successes, but we don't really want to talk about our duds. But I want to talk about my duds because I think there's a lot of learning in those duds. The thing about storytelling that people don't seem to realize is that sometimes you could have the best story, you could have the best type of audience, you could have zeroed in on what their needs are, and for some reason, it just won't land. This is just human psychology. Sometimes your storytelling will just not land. I don't know if I know like a professional speaker, for example, that would tell me they have a hit rate where their message speaks to people every time. I would think they would tell me, yeah, probably like 30-40% of the time. It's powerful, it's dynamic, it's impacting. And then maybe 50-60% of the time, it's kind of meh. And we have to remember that storytelling and marketing in general is a numbers game. It's just a numbers game. So the importance of telling good stories increases the probability of having successful metrics. Like, let's just say if marketing at its bare bones, you put a story out there in form of social media, for example. Marketing is a 50-50 gamble. You could spend hundreds of hours in a marketing campaign and it could just fall flat. If somebody had figured out how to make marketing not a 50-50 gamble, they would be the top marketing agency. They would have millions of dollars. Some people have figured it out more so. People, though, have figured out how to increase that 50% to 60%, 70%. But there's always going to be a percentage of we just don't know, right? So we have to remind ourselves that even when you storytell in your marketing, in your branding, in your business development, there's always a probability that it might not work. But what can we learn from that, right? So one of my biggest things with storytelling is telling a great story already takes that 50-50 gamble and increases it, I would say, to a 60% effectiveness. If you can tell a great story, you're going to have great results, period. Every time I tell a great story in my marketing or in my clients' marketing, we see the results. It may not be as high as like some of those high threshold ones where we get really dynamic results and it's powerful, but we still see results. And then there's sometimes where we just produce a video that we thought was going to be on the right track. We thought we zeroed in on that audience. We thought we were doing it right, and it just doesn't hit. And I tell people all the time, like, especially in storytelling, figure out why. Figure out why it didn't hit. And then the same thing goes for the successful moments. Figure out why. So going into this nonprofit that had a tremendous amount of success, we hit the market at the right time. They had a lot of things working for them. And so our video that we produced for them, the storytelling that we did for them with their brand, it was all timely, right? We hit it at the right time. And there was a lot of intentionality from their team. They had just come out of a really big win where basically their genetic researchers told them, hey, we think there's a high likelihood if we get the funding for this, we could cure this disease forever. I can't imagine a better motivator for a team than that, especially when you're talking about solving a neurological disease in children. So there was momentum, there was timeliness, there was an audience ripened for this. They had already had a successful campaign before we got to this new campaign. So we were kind of compounding on the success that was previously there. When you're starting the journey of storytelling, expect resistance, okay? Like the biggest thing that I tell people, especially when you're starting a social media or things like that, it takes time. You have to soften the audience. You have to soften people up so the resistance gets minimized. The one thing that I think I've learned in the 5 years of doing this and running this agency and seeing these stories see success in people's lives and businesses, people don't care about how authentic you are in your storytelling. They care about how much trust they can have in you while you're telling your story. That's a clear indicator these days. We're seeing the death of the influencer right now on social media because I think people are like, they're not trustworthy, some of these social media influencers. I think the reason why brands like yours, Brian, are successful is because you constantly provide trust to the people. They can trust that they can come to your show and they can get some valuable insight and information. People want to know, like, and trust. They want to work with people they know, like, and trust, right? And so if you're not getting people that are working with you, it means that in some form of your storytelling, somewhere that wherever you're doing it, that trust layer is not being bridged yet. So how in your storytelling do you create trust breaking barriers or trust barrier breakers? How do you create opportunities for people to trust you more, right? The reason why I like to, when I tell my personal story, when I'm talking with people about my personal journey, I love throwing the fact that I'm a family guy in there. I'm a family man. I love my family. It's one, true, and two, it disarms people because how many marketing agency owners have we met that are just out to take your money and then run with it? It's stupidly it's a stupidly high number of situations that I've heard about. And so I want to remind people, hey, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't want that for my family. I don't want that for yours as well. So when I tell my story, I throw little nuggets in there that immediately just like disarm people and break down that trust barrier so that when I tell stories, when I keep telling stories, people can attach to me. So I think that's hopefully that answers your question. There's a lot of the storytelling to conversions is the secret that no one has yet to figure out. And the people who have kind of figured it out, they see a big, like maybe a higher percentage hit rate on their storytelling, but it's still not 100%. I don't know if anybody will ever figure out how to do it at 100%, unless you're like Mr. Beast and you just can spend hundreds of millions of dollars per video. So that's kind of, hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
Yes, it more than answers the question, James. In fact, I'm very excited to put you on the spot in just a minute with your best piece of advice for entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs, because time is flying by. But before we get there, I honestly, so much of what has attracted us to your brand, James, and why we were so excited to invite you and have you here on the show is because this is the real stuff behind the scenes. I don't think most people openly admit this stuff, but this is really the only way we get through all of these barriers. You and I have both introduced so many limiting beliefs. You and I are also entrepreneurs, so we understand what we've gone through in our own journeys. And I love how generously and transparently and openly you share it with our listeners. The hit rate thing, you really got me thinking as you were talking about it. I'm a big fan of live comedy. I go to a ton of comedy shows, and anytime I go with one of my friends, we walk out of there, and how many jokes that they hit on are we talking about? Usually one or two jokes where we're just like, oh my gosh, that one story that they told or that joke was so funny. The rest, quite frankly, I have enough friends that are comics that I've since learned the rest of their material is them just trying new things, and a lot of them do flop. And James, someone who you're so talented at what you do, you're openly acknowledging that is such an invitation to all of us to step into just telling more stories and trying them and openly acknowledging the fact that they're probably not going to work. So with all of that said, James, I'm excited to hear the piece of advice you're going to leave listeners with, because you're not only good at what you do, but like I said, you're one of us, you're a fellow entrepreneur. So with all of that in mind, knowing that our listeners are at all different stages of their own business growth journeys, what's that one piece of entrepreneurial advice that you want to leave them with today?
Oh man, this is such a tough question to answer. I'm a big believer in knowing what your enough is. In fact, this was what was spoken to me when I first journeyed into entrepreneurship. And the guy who spoke it to me, he's a good friend of mine. And I remember the setting. I remember what we were talking about. And I asked him this very question. I was like, what he had been doing business for 15, 20 years. I was like, what do I need to know? And he stopped and he just thought, and he said, just know what your enough is. And I never thought that statement alone would have as much value for my entrepreneurial journey as it has. There are some days where you will wake up and just getting to the computer, just getting on the phone and calling the lead, just doing the job is your enough. And you have to be okay with that. I think as entrepreneurs and as success-minded people, I don't think you jump into entrepreneurship if you're not a driven person. And the catch-22 of being a driven person is that you're probably the most critical of your own trajectory and momentum, right? But at the end of the day, you've gone already. If you're doing this, you've already done something that a majority of the population dreams of doing. I think I saw a statistic the other day that said that 19% of the world's population are business owners or entrepreneurs. And that number might be fluctuating every single day. But I was like, holy cow, 19% of the world are economy boosters. They are world changers. They are community changers. They are family makers. They are revenue makers. Like 19% of the world are driving the entire world. So you're doing something. Like you're doing something. Just you getting up that day, even though it's so hard, know what your enough is. And then not only that, but when you're making money, right? When you're seeing success, I see a lot of entrepreneurs, and I'm sure you've seen this too, Brian. Sadly, they don't know what their enough is, and they just keep clawing and clawing and clawing, and they don't know what their enough is, and then they end up sacrificing their families. They end up sacrificing their friends. They put all these things on this altar of their business, and they sacrifice it all because they don't know what their enough is. And if you can know what your enough is, you could wake up one day and you could be like, I'm making more money than I ever thought I had. I'm having a better life than I ever thought I have, even through the hard parts. And I am enjoying myself more than I ever thought I could. And that is enough. And that is enough. The entrepreneurship game is an addictive game. The highs are so addictive. The lows are so debilitating. But know what your enough is along the way. And I think you're going to be successful.
Amen to all that. James, you've given me goosebumps with those words of wisdom right there. I'm so appreciative for you sharing that. I'm also super excited. I've obviously seen your work in action because the two of us talking behind some microphones, that's one thing. But to see these stories come to life in the production that your team does, in the way that you frame these, it's so cool going deep into your work. So drop those links on us for listeners who want to see your sizzle reel where you showcase other stories that you've been a part of helping to bring to life and all the great work that you're doing. Drop those links on us. Where should listeners go from here?
Yeah. So you can find us. We're on Instagram primarily at StoryPath Creative. I'm also trying to grow our YouTube right now, StoryPath Creative there as well. We have a little bit of like a story-based, if you want to really see some dynamic stories, I mean, these stories are crazy cool and powerful. We just dropped a new podcast series. It's very visual, very short form styled. And that's called our Storycast series. That's over on our YouTube. And then, we actually, it's crazy because I'm premiering my very first mini documentary tonight, local to me. And then we'll be releasing that on our YouTube probably next week. And so I'm really nervous and excited, but this is like the first big production that I've done. And so, that's where you can find us, pretty much Instagram and YouTube.
Yes, and listeners, you already know the drill. We're making it as easy as possible for you to find all of those links down below in the show notes. We're also linking to James's business website, which is yourstorypath.com. You don't need to remember any of these things. You can just go down to the show notes, no matter where it is that you're tuning in, and click right on through. And also, by the time you're hearing this, James's documentary is out into the world. So much good stuff on his YouTube channel. So definitely pound those links in the show notes down below. Otherwise, James, on behalf of myself and all the listeners worldwide, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. This was a blast.